It had been 5 long years since Sergeant Daniel Harper last saw his dog, Duke. The memory still haunted him, Duke's brown eyes, full of loyalty and love, staring up at him as they said goodbye. They had been through so much together. They had fought side by side in the harshest conditions, facing danger and uncertainty every day. Duke wasn't just a dog. He was Daniel's partner, his friend, and in many ways, his family. But when the war ended, so did their time together. Duke was sent to a different home, a place where he could be cared for and loved, but Daniel couldn't shake the ache in his heart. The years passed, and though he tried to move forward, there was always that lingering emptiness. He missed his dog. Now, as Daniel stood in the parking lot of the adoption center, his palms were sweaty, his heart racing. The moment was finally here. He had been waiting for this day, dreaming about it, and hoping beyond hope that it was real. Today he was going to be reunited with Duke. He couldn't wait to see him, to hold him, and to make up for the time they had lost. But as he waited, a question kept playing over and over in his mind. Would Duke still remember him? Daniel stood at the entrance of the adoption center, his breath caught in his throat. The doors were still closed, but he could hear the soft sound of barking from the other side. His pulse quickened. This is it, he thought. The moment he had dreamed of for years was just a few steps away. But as he waited, a sense of doubt crept into his mind. What if Duke didn't remember him? What if he had changed too much? The door finally opened, and a woman appeared with a leash in her hand. "Are you Sergeant Harper?" she asked with a kind smile. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "I'm here to see Duke." The woman's eyes softened. "I'll bring him out for you," she said, stepping back into the building. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, waiting. What would Duke be like now? After a moment, the woman returned, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. There, walking slowly beside her, was Duke. He was older, his fur a little grayer around the muzzle, and his gait seemed slower. But those eyes, those familiar, loving eyes were still the same. They met Daniel's gaze, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stood still. Duke stopped in his tracks. His ears perked up, and his nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Then, without warning, his body shook, as if he couldn't believe it either. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his tail starting to wag slowly. Daniel's chest tightened. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't dare blink. He couldn't look away. The dog he had shared so much with, the one who had kept him going during the hardest times, was standing in front of him again. Duke let out a soft bark, his tail wagging faster now, and suddenly he bolted toward Daniel. The moment they made contact, Daniel dropped to his knees, and Duke jumped into his arms, his paws landing on Daniel's chest. The warmth of Duke's body, the familiar smell of his furet, all felt like home. "Duke, boy, I missed you so much," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The dog licked his face, his body trembling with excitement, as if he too couldn't believe what was happening. Duke's joy was contagious, and Daniel laughed, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. The woman stepped back, watching the reunion with a soft smile. "It seems like he remembers you just fine," she said. Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions rushing through him. Duke was no longer the young, energetic dog he had known. His body had aged, but in his eyes, Daniel could see the same love, the same loyalty. Duke had never forgotten him. As Duke settled into his arms, Daniel knew in that moment that their bond had never been broken. The years apart had been hard, but they had both been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would be reunited, and nothing else would ever matter again. After the reunion, Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had Duke back. The joy he felt in that moment was indescribable. But as the days passed, reality began to set in. Duke, though happy to be with Daniel again, seemed different. He was quiet, hesitant, and seemed scared at times. The dog wouldn't eat much, and when Daniel tried to give him his favorite treats, Duke would sniff them, then walk away. Daniel sat on the floor, watching as Duke curled up on the couch, his body tense. The dog would glance up at Daniel from time to time, but he didn't seem to trust the new surroundings completely. The bond between them was there, but it wasn't the same as it once had been. It made Daniel wonder, did Duke still remember the training we had? The commands I gave him? Did he forget everything after all this time? The truth was, Daniel wasn't sure what to expect after their long separation. He had hoped that it would be like they had never been apart, but the reality was far different. Duke was dealing with his own struggles, and Daniel wasn't sure how to help him. One evening, Daniel found himself staring at the bills on the table. There were rent payments, car payments, and food. The money wasn't enough to cover everything, especially with Duke's needs. The veterinarian bills had started to pile up too. Duke had a few health issues that needed attention, and Daniel felt the weight of every expense. It was all starting to feel overwhelming. I can't do this, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. What if this was a mistake? What if I'm not enough for him? He wanted to be the one to help Duke, to show him that everything was going to be okay, but he wasn't sure if he had the resources or strength to do it. Alone, his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his sister, Megan. Hey, I heard you got Duke back. That's great. But are you sure this is the right decision? I mean, you're already struggling so much with everything else, and now you have to care for him too. What if it's just too much? Daniel stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the screen. He loved Megan, but her words cut deep. She didn't understand. She hadn't seen the way Duke had been his lifeline during the hardest moments of his life. But maybe Megan had a point. Maybe he had taken on more than he could handle. Still, Daniel couldn't let go of Duke, not after everything. He needed this dog as much as Duke needed him. The next few days were tough. Daniel spent long hours at work, then came home to try and bond with Duke. He had to be patient to earn back the trust that had been lost over time. It was hard, though. Duke would hide under the table when Daniel approached him, and he refused to play with the ball that Daniel used to throw for him. It was as if the dog had lost his confidence, his spirit. But then something small happened. One evening, as Daniel sat on the couch, exhausted from a long day, he heard a soft sound. It was a light thud, followed by the soft click of paws on the wooden floor. He turned to see Duke slowly walk toward him, his tail tucked between his legs. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of trust, of recognition. Duke sat down at his feet, looking up at him with those familiar, soft brown eyes. Daniel held his breath. He reached out a hand, and Duke slowly leaned in, just enough to nuzzle it. His tail gave a tiny, almost hesitant wag. Daniel's heart swelled. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, they sat together in silence, and in that silence, Daniel realized something important. Duke might have been scared, and he might have been struggling, but they were both healing. This was a long journey, and maybe it would take longer than I thought, but I'll be here for him, no matter what. It wasn't an instant fix. The struggles didn't disappear overnight. But little by little, Duke started showing signs of improvement. He would wag his tail more often, and sometimes he would sit closer to Daniel, pressing his head against his leg, a simple gesture that meant so much. There were still challenges. There were days when Duke seemed distant, when he refused to go outside or wouldn't eat. But Daniel kept pushing forward, learning more about Duke's needs and how to support him through the trauma he had experienced. He learned that patience, more than anything, would rebuild their connection. In the quiet moments, when Duke would curl up beside him on the couch, Daniel knew that, despite the hard days, They were growing stronger together, and no matter how tough it got, Daniel wouldn't give up on Duke. They both needed each other, and in the end, that love was stronger than any obstacle they faced. One afternoon, Daniel was cleaning out a small storage closet in the back of the apartment, organizing boxes he hadn't opened in years. He had decided to tidy up the place while Duke napped on the couch. As he moved a stack of old moving boxes to the side, something small and metallic caught his eye beneath a stack of papers. It was a small rusted metal tag, just a bit of old, worn-out metal with a few letters still visible on the surface. Curious, Daniel picked it up and rubbed the dirt off. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what it was. It was a dog tag. Not just any tag, it was Duke's. He recognized the worn letters that spelled out the military unit number, along with Duke's name was engraved in the corner. This wasn't just any tag. It was the one Duke had worn during their time together on the battlefield. Daniel had forgotten it had been left behind in the rush of moving away from the war zone, but here it was, now so much more than a piece of metal. It was a connection to the past, a tangible reminder of everything they had been through. Holding it in his hands, Daniel's mind raced. How had this ended up here? He was sure he had brought Duke's belongings back with him after the war, but maybe in the chaos of everything, he had forgotten this small detail. Was it possible Duke had been carrying it all this time? The idea of it made his chest tighten. As if on cue, Daniel heard a soft rustling behind him. He turned to see Duke slowly making his way into the dog's eyes were locked on the metal tag in Daniel's hand, and for the first time since they had reunited, Duke's entire body seemed to freeze. His ears stood up, and his tail, which usually swayed in gentle movements, was stiff and unmoving. Duke stepped closer, sniffing the air round the tag with an intensity that startled Daniel. The dog's eyes never left it, and for a moment Daniel felt as if Duke could see straight into his heart. He slowly crouched down to Duke's level, holding the tag out in his hand. "Hey, Duke," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Is this yours?" For a long moment, Duke simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the tag. Then, with a soft whimper, he slowly reached out and touched the tag with his nose, his breath quickening. He began to circle Daniel, as if unsure what to do. But Daniel noticed that Duke's movements were not the same as they had been before. There was something different in the way the dog carried himself, something heavy, almost as if he had recognized something from a distant past. Daniel's heart sank as he watched Duke's reaction. Could it be? Could Duke have been carrying this piece of the past with him all along, even after everything had changed? He slowly stood up, holding the tag close to his chest. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" Daniel said softly. Duke looked up at him, his eyes wide with emotion. For a brief moment, it felt as if the two of them were connected in a way that went beyond words connected, not just by the bond they had shared during the war, but also by the shared trauma they had both experienced. Later that night, after dinner, Daniel took Duke for a walk. As they strolled along the quiet streets, Daniel thought about everything he had learned in the past few days. He thought about how much Duke had suffered, how much he had been through, and how much more there was to uncover about the dog's past. Maybe it wasn't just Daniel who had to heal, maybe Duke needed him in ways he hadn't even realized. They passed the park where Daniel and Duke had trained together, the place where they had spent countless hours learning commands and building trust. Duke stopped in his tracks and sniffed the air, his ears twitching as if he recognized the place. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then he walked forward with a new sense of purpose. It was then that Daniel realized something important. Duke had been searching for something all along. Not just for his home, not just for Daniel, but for a sense of security, for a place where he could feel safe again. This was the turning point. It wasn't just about rescuing Duke. It was about helping him find his peace, to heal from the past just as Daniel was. Suddenly, the weight of it all became clear. This wasn't just Duke's journey, it was mine too. Daniel had thought he was rescuing the dog from the past, but in doing so he was healing his own scars thing he hadn't even realized he was still carrying. The shared trauma, the painful memories, they had bonded over them without even realizing it, and together they would find healing. Together they would rebuild what had been lost. Duke looked up at Daniel, his tail giving a tentative wag. It was a small gesture, but to Daniel it meant everything. They were beginning to trust each other piece by piece. The past would never fully leave them, but in that moment it no longer seemed so heavy. Together they could move forward, one step at a time. The days after that moment in the park passed by in a blur. Daniel felt a growing sense of peace with Duke. The dog seemed more at ease, his body less tense, his tail wagging more often. Daniel, too, was starting to feel more settled, like the weight of everything that had happened was slowly lifting. They were healing together bit by bit. But one evening, everything changed. Daniel had left Duke in the apartment while he ran a quick errand to the store. It wasn't long just a quick trip to grab some groceries. When he returned, however, his heart sank. The door to the apartment was slightly ajar, and the apartment was eerily quiet. "Duke?" Daniel called, his voice trembling with unease. No response. Panic surged in his chest as he rushed inside. His eyes scanned the room, but there was no sign of Duke. His heart raced. Where could he be? Daniel ran through the apartment, calling out Duke's name. He checked under the furniture, in the bedroom, and even in the bathroom. Nothing. It was as if the dog had vanished. Without wasting a second, Daniel grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door. He didn't know what had happened, but his mind raced with fear. Had Duke gotten scared again? Was he out there somewhere, confused and alone? He rushed down the stairs of the building and onto the street. "Duke!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. He ran down the sidewalks, desperately calling the dog's name, but all he heard was the sound of his own footsteps. He tried not to think the worst, but his heart ached. What if something happened to him? Minutes felt like hours, and Daniel's body began to tire, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Duke again. After everything they had been through, after everything they had shared, he couldn't let him go.
Just when Daniel was about to give in to hopelessness, he heard a soft whimper, barely audible over the noise of the city. His heart leapt in his chest as he turned toward the alley behind the apartment building. "Duke?" he called, his voice shaking. The whimper came again, louder this time. He followed the sound, his steps quickening. Then, at the far end of the alley, he saw him. Duke was there, standing on the edge of a busy street, his body trembling with fear. He looked lost, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. He hadn't seen Daniel yet. Without thinking, Daniel ran toward him, calling his name once more. "Duke, it's me, boy." The dog's head snapped up, his eyes wide with recognition. But in that moment, something terrible happened. A car sped around the corner, too fast, its headlights blinding. "Duke, no!" Daniel screamed as he rushed forward. Time seemed to freeze as Duke took a step into the street, unaware of the oncoming car. Daniel's heart stopped, and without thinking, he lunged forward, tackling the dog to the ground just as the car screeched to a halt, mere inches away from them. They lay there on the cold asphalt, breathless and shaken. Duke's fur was matted with dirt, his body pressed close to Daniel's, but they were both alive. "Thank God," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling as he hugged Duke tightly. The dog whimpered softly, his body still trembling with fear, but now there was no hesitation. He leaned into Daniel, pressing his head against his chest. The car's driver honked and drove off, but Daniel barely noticed. His heart was pounding in his chest, his body still frozen with the shock of what had just happened. He pulled Duke up gently, tears filling his eyes. "You scared me, boy. You scared me so much." Duke looked up at him with soft, trusting eyes, and for the first time, Daniel realized the true depth of their bond. Duke had trusted him enough to follow him back, even in his fear. And Daniel had trusted him enough to risk everything to keep him safe. "I'll never let you go again," Daniel whispered, holding the dog close. "No matter what." That night, Daniel sat on the couch, Duke curled up beside him, both of them quiet and still. The events of the day weighed heavily on him, but there was something else, something deep and unspoken between them. They had both been through so much, and yet here they were, together. Duke nuzzled closer, resting his head on Daniel's lap, his soft breathing the only sound in the room. Daniel gently ran his fingers through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth and steady presence of the animal that had become his anchor in this world. It was then that Daniel realized this wasn't just about rescuing Duke anymore. This was about healing together. The bond between them, tested and strengthened by every trial, had transformed them both in ways they never expected. The dog, who once lived in fear, now had a home. And Daniel, who carried scars of his own, had found a new sense of purpose. They weren't just saving each other, they were growing together. In the quiet of that room, Daniel whispered, "You're my second chance too, Duke, and I'll never let you go."